Today, Saturday 28th September, is my last day in Kuala Lumpur. Tomorrow I fly back to London. It will be a 12-hour flight, and it may be the case that what with that long flight and problems with times and all of that, that I will not be able to do a video tomorrow. If so, then apologies in advance. I will try to do a video. It may be a short one again, but anyway, we'll have to wait. I'll have to wait and see. But as I said, apologies in advance, but be prepared for the possibility that there will be no video from me tomorrow. Anyway, let us turn to the news today, and the news is becoming deeply dramatic and very concerning. And of course, the big story is the situation in the Middle East, where there are reports, or if there are reports, the Israeli authorities, the Israeli military, are claiming that an Israeli bomb strike in southern Beirut on a Hezbollah command bunker has killed the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, and most of the top leadership of Hezbollah. And all of that is taking place even as more bombing continues of southern Beirut, of Hezbollah positions in southern Beirut and in southern Lebanon. And by the way, even as rocket attacks by Hezbollah continue against Israel. If Nasrallah is dead, about which in a moment, it still doesn't seem to be affecting Hezbollah's abilities to continue launching missiles and rockets towards Israel. Though the number of the rockets and missiles that Hezbollah is launching is not clear to me. But anyway, it seems that the intensity of those strikes has not diminished. Anyway, the attack on Nasrallah took place shortly after a speech by Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel to the United Nations General Assembly. And, well, very much like the speech that Prime Minister Netanyahu gave a few weeks ago to Congress, it seemed to me absolutely clear that this is a man, the head of a government, who is looking for a conflict, a wider conflict in the Middle East. He spoke in fierce terms of Hezbollah and and by extension of Nasrallah, but he also spoke in equally fierce terms about Iran. And I ought to say that an article appeared in the Daily Telegraph, which said that the attack on Hezbollah, on Hezbollah's command group, the attempt, perhaps successful, to assassinate Nasrallah himself, threw down the gauntlet. It was Israel, a case of Israel, or perhaps one should say Prime Minister Netanyahu, throwing down the gauntlet to Iran. And I read lots of commentaries and articles about this in other parts of the media as well. And by the way, there was an interesting article by the Guardian journalist Peter Beaumont, who is one of the veteran foreign affairs journalists that you still find in the British media. Anyway, he said in that article that there was an understanding, an informal understanding between Israel and Hezbollah, that neither side would target the other's leaders, and that obviously the decision by Israel to go after Nasrallah violated or fundamentally erased that understanding and that joint red line. And you may remember that a couple of days ago, some time ago, about a week ago, I think, in fact, I mentioned that the Israeli authorities were talking about some kind of assassination plot that Iran supposedly had prepared against Prime Minister Netanyahu. Allegedly, a 70-plus old man in Israel had been arrested by the Israeli authorities, who had been picked by Iran as the intended assassin, and he was supposedly admitting to all of this. Well, Peter Beaumont, in the same article, casts doubt on that story and suggests that, in fact, this was all part of the preparations leading up to this attempted assassination of Nasrallah, which took place last night. And as for the person who made the decision, made the final decision for this strike, as to that, there is no doubt at all, because Prime Minister Netanyahu and his officials have released a photograph of Prime Minister Netanyahu in his hotel room in New York, speaking on the telephone, presumably to the Israeli headquarters, and apparently giving the instructions for the attack on this bunker in Beirut, where Nasrallah and the other top leadership of Hezbollah was supposed to be. And supposedly they were all there meeting members of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps. Another of those meetings between Hezbollah and the Iranians, which have been apparently very fraught, in which the Iranians have sought to explain their own restraint in the face of the attacks on Hezbollah and on Lebanon by the Israelis. And the Israelis, who is clear to me, have now managed to a great extent to penetrate Hezbollah's security systems, apparently picked up the fact that this meeting was taking place and decided to carry out this attack on this bunker. At least that's the story that we are getting. Now, of course, as of now, the only information that Nasrallah is dead, the only definite claims to that effect, are coming from Israeli sources, from the Israeli military. However, in recent weeks, when the Israelis have confirmed the death of a Hezbollah official, Hezbollah itself has confirmed the fact, sometimes a day or so later. So the fact that the Israelis are saying that they have this information and that they made a public statement linking their credibility to the claim that Nasrallah is dead strongly leads me to think that he is indeed dead, that he has indeed been killed. Now, I say that there's something else which makes me think that this is likely true. For hours before the Israeli announcement, reports were circulating in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, that Nasrallah had survived the attack. And until shortly before the announcement, the Israeli announcement, I saw that the Iranian media agency, Press TV, was saying on its website that Nasrallah had been uninjured, that he had not been killed, and that none of the other leaders of Hezbollah had been killed in this attack. And then, roughly at the same time that the Israeli announcement was made, I noticed that all of those reports on Press TV, and I checked elsewhere in the Iranian media, were starting to be deleted. And that also, I have to say, makes me think more than likely that Nasrallah is indeed dead. Having said that, just before I made this program, I saw a further report whose reliability I cannot vouch, which said that not only is Nasrallah still alive, but that he is shortly going to make a public appearance. So it could be that my assumption that he is dead is going to be proved wrong very shortly. But I don't know how reliable that last report is, and anyway, probably by the time you're watching this program, we will know. My view, as of this moment in time, is that almost certainly he is indeed dead. Anyway, there we are. Now, the question then comes back to Iran. And I'm going to repeat the point I have been making ever since basically the attack on the Iranian embassy building in Damascus back in April. Then we had the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. And then we've had the various attacks on Hezbollah over the last week or so. Now we've had this assassination attempt and probable assassination of Hassan Nasrallah himself. Well, it's absolutely clear to me, and I think anybody listening to Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech to the UN General Assembly can see that the objective is the same as always. It is to force the Iranians into some kind of strong reaction which will result in a conflict between Iran and Israel. And ultimately, not just a conflict between Iran and Israel, but a conflict in which the Western powers, the United States, the European powers, are drawn into the conflict with Iran. That, I have to say, remains my impression. And the Iranians, for their part, now have to make incredibly difficult decisions. They have exercised extreme restraint, as they would say, in the face of all that has been happening. When they did conduct a missile strike on Israel in April, by their own account, they pulled their punches. They made sure that the Americans were informed well in advance of the missile and rocket strike, and ensured that the Israelis and the Americans were thereby prepared for the drones and the rockets and the missiles as they reached Israel. And then after the Haniyeh assassination, despite repeatedly stating that Iran would retaliate against Israel, well, they've been biding their time. They've been apparently negotiating arms deals with the Russians and receiving weapons from the Russians, air defense weapons. The secretary of the Russian Security Council, Sergei Shoigu, has been to Iran on at least 2 occasions since April. But we've not yet seen any Iranian attack on Israel. And then we've had the attacks on Hezbollah, and now we've had the most extreme provocation, as the Iranians would see it, of all, which is the attempt to assassinate Nasrallah, and very likely the assassination of Nasrallah. And we've been getting reports that the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, has been in conference with his top officials in Tehran. And there are also reports in Al Arabiya, Saudi, I believe it's a Saudi media agency, that Ayatollah Khamenei has himself been relocated to a place of safety, which is an ominous sign indeed. Now, that suggests that perhaps the Iranians have now reached that point where they feel that they have no real choice but to start their own operations, counter-operations against Iran, against Israel, that to continue to sit on their hands, as many people are saying, for much longer would destroy Iran's credibility amongst its allies in the Middle East. So we could very well be on the brink of a wider war. The Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, is warning of this in New York, where he's attending the General Assembly. And I think this is a very strong possibility. One person who I have to say is far from acting to restrain the situation or calm the situation, seems on the contrary to be behaving in a way that will aggravate it, at least in my opinion, is the US Secretary of State, Tony Blinken. He's gone out of his way to say that Israel is acting legitimately, that it is defending itself, that Hezbollah is the aggressor in this matter. At least that's how his words, in my opinion, should be interpreted. I doubt that everybody in the US government agrees, but the president himself, President Biden, is saying nothing. He's made no public comment at the moment. Apparently the Pentagon or someone in the US government, according to some reports, has contacted Iran and has told the Iranians that the United States was given no prior warning by Israel of this attack on this bunker in southern Beirut. Whether the Iranians believe any of that now, I really wonder. But anyway, all of that, it seems that Secretary Blinken, perhaps sensing that there is no one really in control in Washington who can bring him back into line, is making his statements supporting Israel, whereas the president himself, and by the way, the vice president, are silent. As I said, as we discussed, Alex Christoforou and I, on the Duran, following Netanyahu's trip to the United States, following his visit to Congress, it's absolutely clear to me that Prime Minister Netanyahu senses the existence of a power vacuum in Washington, and he is acting now to take advantage of it, to advance his agenda of a wider war in the Middle East. So that's, I think, the summary of the situation at the present time. We must now again wait and see what the Iranian reaction is going to be. I think that all kinds of third parties, I don't mean the Europeans and the Americans, but third parties like the Russians, the Chinese, others, have been trying to persuade the Iranians to exercise restraint, certainly ahead of the BRICS summit meeting in October. I suspect that the Iranians are going to find it increasingly difficult to listen to that advice, and I wonder whether that advice will continue to be given, at least to the extent that it has been up to now. But anyway, we will have to wait and see. But we are on the brink of a wider war in the Middle East. In my opinion, we've been heading in that direction for some time now, certainly since April. We're drawing closer and closer, and I would not be surprised if it starts to break out fully, properly, at some point over the next few days. To finish, and to repeat a point I have made before, I don't think any of this in the long term or even the medium term is going to play out to Israel's long-term advantage. On the contrary, I think the effect of this war is going to deepen problems within Israel itself, reduce its security further, and is putting further pressure on Israel's economy. And I noticed, by the way, that the American credit rating agencies are again taking steps to reduce still further, indeed to very low status, very low levels, Israel's formerly very, very high credit rating. So anyway, this is what I'm going to say today about the conflict in the Middle East. Probably there'll be an awful lot of developments over the next couple of hours. I may return to them if I'm able to in a video tomorrow. And certainly on the Duran, we will be discussing the latest developments more thoroughly when I get back to London. Anyway, there is one further point, however, that I do want to make, which is that the situation in the Middle East is extremely dangerous. It could very well spiral out of control. But I remain of the view that the more important conflict in geopolitical terms continues to be the one in Ukraine. And there's been a really quite brilliant article, in my opinion, by the blogger who I know as Aurélien. I have no idea who he is, but he has a blog on Substack. It's an article that, again, I learnt about from the historian Jeff Roberts. He sent me the link. Anyway, Aurélien makes the point, which is, in my opinion, irrefutably true, that the big result of this war in Ukraine that has played out over the last 2.5 years is that it has demonstrated conclusively that Russia is far and away the strongest military power in Europe. It is far more powerful than any European state, any other European state, or, by the way, coalition of European states. It has demonstrated the depth of its resources, its enormous industrial and technological capacities, the resilience of its global alliances, and it's a point that Aurélien makes, and it's a good point, its ability to absorb losses, human losses, deaths of soldiers, in order to achieve its security and geopolitical objectives. The only power in Europe that is able to counter Russia is the United States, and the US's own long-term commitment to Europe has been exposed as fraying to a greater extent than has been the case at any time since the Second World War. So, even though Russia is not the Soviet Union, it's still significantly less powerful as a superpower than the Soviet Union was in its heyday. In a kind of a way, in a certain sense, the military and resource balance in the European part of the Eurasian continent has tilted further in its favor, even as compared to the situation, say, at the height of the Cold War. And that will have long-term geopolitical implications. It will mean that the balance of power in Western Eurasia will have shifted decisively in Russian favor and ultimately in favor of the BRICS states. And that will, at some point, shape the future of Europe. And, by the way, since we're talking about it, we've just been talking about it, of the Middle East as well. Anyway, very interesting article. I would strongly recommend reading it. Let's now turn to the situation in Ukraine. And before I actually turn to what's going on in Ukraine itself, to what's going on the battle lines, let's finish with President Zelensky's trip to the United States. I believe, as a matter of fact, that he's still there. Anyway, he's rounded off his trip with a meeting in New York with former President Donald Trump, who, of course, may, in January next year, become President Trump of the United States all over again. And, well, this meeting took place against a backdrop of apparent criticisms of Trump and of J.D. Vance by Zelensky himself, of criticisms by Republicans of what they saw as pro-Democrat interference in the US elections by the Ukrainians, recriminations in Kiev that the relationship with the Republicans had been badly mismanaged, and a begging letter by President Zelensky to Donald Trump, begging for a meeting. So the background to the meeting was not a happy one. And from what I could see, neither was the meeting itself. The meeting, when the meeting ended, Donald Trump seemed to be pretty confident and happy looking. He was walking around with a spring in his step. You could not say the same about President Zelensky. He seemed, I thought, tired and angry. President Trump made no supportive comments about President Zelensky's victory plan or anything of that kind. He still seemed to talk about the need for a negotiated end to the war and to sort of turn the life a little into Zelensky. He spoke about the fact that he and President Zelensky got on very well with each other, but then Trump also got on very well with President Putin of Russia, and that would facilitate the process towards negotiating the end to the war that President Trump, former president, perhaps future President Trump, is seeking. These were, of course, all messages that Zelensky himself most emphatically will not have wanted to hear. So this rounded off a very uncomfortable, very difficult meeting for Zelensky, one which, in my opinion, clearly did not go at all well. But in every other respect, it seems to me that also other things have started to go wrong for Zelensky as well. The first thing to say is that the point which we made on the Duran, President Zelensky's major objective over the course of this trip was to get the Americans to reaffirm their personal support for him. And yesterday in my video, I said that I thought he just about managed that. I'm now going to qualify this. It's starting to look to me as if the headlines, the articles that are coming out in the American media, the New York Times and other places, are such that people in Kiev will probably feel that maybe things didn't go so well for Zelensky in the United States after all, and maybe the Americans are not backing him quite as strongly as President Zelensky wants everyone to think. So there's an article in the New York Times which speaks about how President Zelensky's personal appeal to his ability to charm and win over people in Congress has faded. The days when he would be able to come to Congress and address Congress and where he would be applauded by members of Congress in various venues, that has passed. He has had one meeting apparently with members of Congress who still support Ukraine, but it was a somewhat muted meeting like many of the others. And there just doesn't seem to be the enthusiasm for him in Congress that there was at one time. Well, I think that will not have gone down well with Zelensky himself. Putting aside what really happened over the course of that meeting, he won't have been happy with the article that has appeared in the New York Times saying all of those things. But I think he's going to be even less happy when, now that he's perhaps been given a more clear breakdown of what the $8 billion that he's been promised by the Americans really amounts to. Because it's clear that it is going to be far less than $8 billion. In fact, most of it, apparently, is going to take the form of funding for long-term contracts that the US government, not, by the way, Ukraine, is taking out with various US arms manufacturers to produce weapons which might eventually be supplied to Ukraine in a few weeks' time, a few months' time, or sometimes in a couple of years' time. And of course, Zelensky doesn't have those years, as he clearly knows. So that cannot have pleased him. For the record, I go along very much with the theory that my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou floated some months ago, which is that many of these appropriations, these funds, supposedly to produce weapons, are really intended to close positions, that contracts, or at least orders for weapons, have already been made for some time, that the weapons are already being produced, that the costs have been incurred by the defense producing companies, and that what needs to happen, therefore, is for the United States government to close the books on those contracts, to put up the money to cover those contracts. And this is probably what this is, to a great extent, so I suspect, all about. So I don't think President Zelensky is going to be happy with this development at all. It looks as if he's being told that he is being given $8 billion of aid by the United States, but in reality, it's going to be much, much less than that. In fact, I saw one report which suggested that it might be as little as $1.6 billion, which, given how much Ukraine spends, isn't going to last more than a few weeks. Just saying. So, on that, Ian Proud, former British diplomat who runs his own blog on Substack, has written a fine piece about the $50 billion loan, about the extreme unwisdom of using the interest from the frozen Russian assets to pay this $50 billion loan. I've discussed this loan extensively in recent programs. That doing so, more likely than not, is going to be another factor that is going to incentivize the Russians to continue the war. All of that was very interesting, and it's very well set out in Ian Proud's piece. And one of the most interesting things was that Ian Proud also provided a link to an article in the Financial Times by Martin Sandbu, writer for the Financial Times, who's been a fervid supporter of Ukraine. And Martin Sandbu, set out in detail the many legal problems with the $50 billion loan idea, how it might be very difficult to get around those problems. I've discussed all of that in previous programs. I'm not going to repeat all of this. But he also gave away a piece of information about this loan, this $50 billion loan plan, about which I had absolutely no idea, which is that supposedly when the money is put together, when the funds have all been raised, and Martin Sandbu seems to think that governments can raise $50 billion without getting approval from their parliaments, and I just don't believe that is the case at all, but never mind. Anyway, once the money is put together and all the arrangements are in place, the guarantees have been given and the funds from the frozen assets have been secured, the money will then be funneled to Ukraine by a trusted independent agency, and reference was made to the World Bank. I wonder whether the World Bank has been asked about this and what it will say. I think if something like this is done, if money, which the Russians would say has been stolen from them, is being used to service a loan provided by the World Bank, then I think the global credibility of the World Bank, such as it is, will have been completely and irrevocably shattered. Not just, by the way, with the Russians, but with all countries outside the West. Just saying. Anyway, Martin Sandbu seemed skeptical that the $50 billion loan proposal would ever succeed. And if $8 billion is the sum that the United States says it's giving, well, $1.6 billion is the sum it is actually giving, well, Zelensky must feel, and the Ukrainians must feel, that they have in effect been cut off. Now, there are voices in the West that still want to support Ukraine. And I discussed yesterday an article which has appeared in The Spectator, written by Owen Matthews, in which he said that the Ukrainians need to be realistic and they need to agree to accept the fact that the Russians are going to remain in occupation of the territories they currently occupy in eastern Ukraine, but that the Ukrainians can then apparently freeze the conflict on that basis and can then press forward with integrating the 80% of Ukraine that's left into NATO. And there's been, interestingly, an identical article, an article suggesting the same thing in The Economist. Now, I mentioned in my video yesterday that Owen Matthews has been a fervid supporter of Ukraine. The Economist has, if anything, gone even further in its fervour. They have been full on in their support of Ukraine, and of course they have been relentless critics of President Putin's for decades, so perhaps that is unsurprising. But this latest article, which has just appeared in The Economist, an article by an article which whose title is "The War is Going Badly, Ukraine and its allies must change course." Well, this article goes further still. It basically says the same thing as Owen Matthews, that the war is being lost, that Ukraine can't keep on fighting, that ideas of a stalemate are really pie in the sky, that Ukraine must be realistic, that if Ukraine continues, and President Zelensky continues to insist that the only basis upon which he's prepared to talk is that the entire territory of pre-2014 Ukraine, including Crimea and Donbass, must be returned to Ukraine intact, and that the Russians must withdraw from all of this territory, and that there can be no freeze of the conflict or ceasefire until that happens. Well, The Economist says if they continue, the Ukrainians and Zelensky continue to talk in that way, then there is really no possibility of the war ending. Ukraine will lose, and Ukraine's Western backers will increasingly lose hope and will become frustrated and will decide that there is really no point in continuing to support a president and a country who are in effect committing suicide. That's what The Economist says. So, as the title of the article in The Economist implies, The Economist argues for a major change of course. And they're saying that what needs to happen is that the Western powers, the Ukrainians, need to give up the idea that they can recapture their territory. The Economist doesn't talk about a freeze or a ceasefire. They are suggesting instead that the West supply Ukraine with vast numbers of additional weapons. There's no explanation, by the way, of where these weapons are supposed to come from, but vast amounts of additional weapons. That Ukraine go on the defensive and try to hold the Russians back. And The Economist seems alone, as far as I can see now, in assuming that Ukraine can hold the Russians back. If that does indeed happen, so that's the other part of the plan. By the way, just to say, that was something that Jim Webb and George Beebe suggested that Ukraine do, well, more than a year ago now, in that article they wrote in Time magazine. I pointed out before that that might have been a viable strategy for the Ukrainians to have turned to, not just then, in the middle of their disastrous summer 2023 offensive, but arguably much sooner than that, much earlier than that, in the winter of 2022-2023. But anyway, The Economist, far too late, has come round to that particular military strategy, and they're saying that Ukraine should also simultaneously be invited to join NATO, and that it should be rushed through into NATO immediately, even as the fighting doesn't exactly stop. There's not going to be a ceasefire or an armistice, supposedly. But the fact of joining NATO will in some magical or miraculous way stabilize the entire situation. And they don't really explain how or why that would be the case, but they do acknowledge that there might be real dangers, real risks in adopting that approach. NATO membership entails risks. If Russia struck Ukraine again, America could face a terrible dilemma: to back Ukraine and risk war with a nuclear foe, or refuse and weaken its alliances around the world. However, abandoning Ukraine would also weaken all of America's alliances, one reason China, Iran and North Korea are backing Russia. Well, that's The Economist's idea. Apparently you must risk nuclear war, which it's admitted might be a genuine possibility. It was risk nuclear war by admitting Ukraine into NATO immediately, and hope that the Russians don't call your bluff, even though, as far as I can see, they would have overwhelming incentives to do so. They would almost certainly, given that NATO membership for Ukraine, for them, is a red line, they would almost certainly say that they do not recognize Ukraine as a member of NATO, and they would press on and conduct their military operation, in which case the United States would be faced with that dilemma that The Economist is talking about. Now, that is not wise statesmanship. That is folly. That is simple, straightforward folly. No government should ever put itself in that sort of position. If the United States is going to lose credibility because Ukraine is going to be defeated outside NATO, going to war with Russia to defend Ukraine because it is in NATO, and risking World War III would be existential. And if instead the United States backed off and the bluff were called, despite what The Economist says, the damage to the United States' credibility and to the NATO alliance would be far greater, because everybody would see that Article 5 of the Washington Treaty is a dead letter. I cannot believe that in the United States, in Washington itself, there are not people in the Pentagon, in the State Department, in the National Security Council, even in the White House, who can see that. And of course, I'm sure also that many of the governments across Europe would be able to see that as well. All of that demonstrates the desperate situation that Ukraine is in now. And on that topic, by the way, there's been, just to round off with articles, another fine article by the Canadian historian Paul Robinson, who also discusses the military situation in Ukraine. And he still seems to think that there's a sort of stalemate situation and there might be negotiations at some point. But he also acknowledges that Ukraine is now manifestly losing the war, much as The Economist does, much as Owen Matthews did, and that the realities are that at the current stage, we're looking at a situation in World War II terms more like the one that Germany found itself in the middle of 1944 than, say, the situation Germany found itself in 1942. About that, I completely agree. Now, all of these proposals, all of these ideas are, it seems to me, completely absurd. The idea that you can somehow find some way of turning the situation round. Paul Robinson, by the way, makes the point that, giving Ukraine more of the same, which is what the Americans seem to be promising at the moment, isn't going to change the situation in Ukraine. And he is absolutely right. But realistically, the Americans are not in a position to do more than more of the same, other than take these incredible risks, which I believe even they would not be prepared to take. So, the best way to approach this, if you are a Western leader, is to recognize two things. Firstly, that Ukraine is going to lose the war and Russia is going to win the war. That is one. And the second is to accept that President Zelensky himself and the current government in Kiev, and more likely than not, any other government in Kiev that replaces President Zelensky, are also incapable of ending the war on a negotiated basis. And that in order to avoid the ultimate geopolitical catastrophe that must ensue, some sort of outreach to the Russians now is essential. And that will mean accepting that Ukraine cannot join NATO, accepting that it will indeed be neutral, accepting that the Russians will insist on extremely tough security guarantees for whatever remains of Ukraine after the war is ended. These could, by the way, extend to Ukraine agreeing to the presence of Russian troops in parts of Ukraine which are nominally unoccupied, places like Odessa, Zhytomyr, for example, just saying, accepting all of this, acknowledging that all of this is going to happen, accepting that Moscow is probably going to insist also on a major say on the political structures in Kiev as well. And also accepting that the Russians, as part of this settlement, will almost certainly insist now on that which should have happened long ago, which is a major discussion and a renegotiation of the security architecture of Europe. Now, if that is done, if Western leaders accept that, then it does seem to me that the war might be brought to an end. President Zelensky might oppose it, but if the Western powers indicate that they're prepared to come to some kind of terms with the Russians on that basis, I don't see what the Ukrainians realistically would be able to do. They could go on fighting, but they would obviously and quickly lose in that case. And we would have a route towards some kind of peace. It would be a very cold peace, but it would nonetheless be a peace, a sustainable peace in Europe. It would be one which would have ended, which would have been achieved following a Russian military victory. There would be that shift in the balance of power that Aurélien is talking about in his Substack Peace. But it would be a peace, and it would be one which would leave Europe secure. Just saying. I have seen no evidence that any Western leader has the imagination or the courage to take that kind of step. Perhaps Donald Trump, if he were elected, would do that. Perhaps Kamala Harris might do that. But for the moment, I see no sign that anybody in Washington, let alone in Brussels, or in any European capital, is thinking along these lines. But anyway, if you want my advice as to what to do, that would be the proposal I would make. And John Helmer has written on his blog, Dances with Bears, a piece in which he's mentioned that over the course of his meetings with Viktor Orban, Putin was accompanied by, amongst others, his aide, Vladimir Medinsky, former culture minister, now in general charge of education policy within the presidential administration. In other words, he's an aide of Putin's. But of course, he was the man who negotiated with the Ukrainians in February and March and April 2022, who's initialed the Istanbul Agreement, and he's already given indications that he would be prepared to resume negotiations on behalf of the Russians as well, if that situation were ever to arise. And Helmer, I think, absolutely correctly says that there would be many, many people in Moscow who would be strongly opposed to negotiations in any form, of any kind, with anybody at this point in time. They want a complete military victory. Putin may have different views, though he's obviously taking the opinions of these people, has to take the opinions of these people into account. But perhaps the re-emergence of Medinsky is a sign that Putin would be prepared to begin some kind of negotiations, but presumably not with the Ukrainians, but perhaps with the Americans. And Helmer suggests that Medinsky's reappearance might be a sign, might be a gesture to Donald Trump. Now, that is all very speculative. I'm going to suggest, actually, that there might be an alternative and more plausible explanation for Medinsky's appearance. I said that the Russians have been under significant pressure recently from the Brazilians, the Chinese, and the Indians to agree to negotiations with the Russians. The position that the Russian government has been taking is that they are not averse to negotiations with the Ukrainians. The one thing they are not going to agree to, however, is a ceasefire. And in my opinion, the reappearance of Medinsky is more intended as a signal to the Brazilians, the Chinese, and the Indians that the Russians are still prepared to sit down to talk with the Ukrainians, albeit without a ceasefire. Then it is intended as a signal to the Americans. But anyway, the fact that Medinsky is there, the fact that he has reappeared, the fact that he's recently participated in a meeting with Putin on cultural policy, that may all be a sign that the Russians are indeed keeping the possibility of negotiations up their sleeve. We shall see. Now, on the question of the Brazilians, the Chinese, and the Indians, the meeting that the Brazilians were seeking to convene in the General Assembly has indeed now taken place. And importantly, it was initially reported that the meeting would be chaired by President Lula's National Security Advisor. But instead, the meeting was chaired by none other than Wang Yi, China's foreign minister, and of course, President Xi Jinping's National Security Advisor. Wang Yi combines both roles. And that shifted the balance of the meeting away from the Brazilians towards the Chinese, which I think the Russians will have undoubtedly welcomed. It turns out that only 17 countries have attended this meeting. So perhaps because the Ukrainians had made it very clear that they're not interested in whatever proposals the Brazilians or the Chinese are putting forward for a freeze of the conflict, ceasefires, negotiations, cessions of territory, that kind of thing. Perhaps because the Ukrainians took that stance, and perhaps because the Russians have also made it very clear that they are not really interested in negotiations with the Ukrainians at this time. Most countries, the great majority of countries, chose to stay away. I suspect also, by the way, that the situation in the Middle East is now absorbing so much interest and attention and diplomatic bandwidth that they didn't have much time. Most countries simply didn't have much time or interest in this meeting that took place at the UN. Anyway, perhaps because Wang Yi was supervising this meeting, it steered away from discussions. It appears to have steered away from discussions about ceasefires. Instead, it reverted back to the language of the Brazilian-Chinese joint statement made way back in May. There was talk about sitting down and negotiating, but no talk about a ceasefire. There was talk about the fact that moves should be made to de-escalate the conflict, which is, in other words, code for the Western powers stopping further arms deliveries to Ukraine. And there was also talk about the importance of not attacking nuclear power stations, and which is more a signal to the Ukrainians than to the Russians, by the way, and of not using nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So it was back to those old topics rather than to the vexed question of an immediate ceasefire, which the Brazilians and the Indians have at times played with, but which the Russians and the Ukrainians both oppose, and which the Chinese understand simply will not fly at this time. So I think from a Russian point of view, this opens the way now for the BRICS summit meeting in Kazan. They don't have to worry about pressure for a ceasefire prior to the BRICS summit in Kazan, though they now do have another whole set of things to worry about, which is with the situation in the Middle East, and they must be asking and worrying and being concerned about what Iran is now going to do. Anyway, there we are. That's the situation, the diplomatic, political situation at the moment. Zelensky's trip to the United States. I'm going to revise my view of yesterday. I think it must now be considered a failure. Zelensky did not get that endorsement, that full-throated endorsement of himself as leader of Ukraine that I think he was looking for. So he comes back to Ukraine basically empty-handed. He's not got the permission to use the missiles against the Russians. He's not going to get many more weapons or very much more money. The question of the $50 billion loan remains up in the air, and there is no commitment to NATO membership for Ukraine. So I think this must be seen overall as a failure. Now, that brings us to the military situation in Ukraine. And here I will say straight away that there are problems in getting a complete picture as to exactly what is going on, because though I suspect a great deal is going on, even Russian websites and Ukrainian websites, but especially Russian websites, are now discussing much more the general situation in the Middle East and the prospects of a war there than they are discussing the situation in Ukraine. So we're left trying to fill the gaps in the picture on the basis of a lot less information than we usually get. But in some ways, that's not such a problem, because it is clear that the general trend of events on the conflict line continue exactly as they have been doing over the last couple of months, in fact the last year, since the Russians began their offensive towards Avdiivka in October of 2023. So let's start with the news, the information that we're getting from the battlefronts. Now, the first thing to say is that our old friend Vladimir Rogov, the official of the regional government in Russian-appointed regional government in Zaporozhye, and a member of a political movement there, leader of a political movement there. Anyway, he's now told TASS that the Russians have captured a major fortified position that the Ukrainians had in Zaporozhye region. He doesn't give exact indications of where this place is, but he does say that it was very close to Orekhov, and he says that the capture of this location close to Orekhov means that the Ukrainians are no longer going to be able to control a wide stretch of territory in northern Zaporozhye region. Well, it's all very interesting, and it might reinforce suspicions that a Russian offensive, perhaps late autumn, winter offensive towards Orekhov and Zaporozhye city by the 130,000 men of Group of Forces Dnieper, led by General Teplinsky, is being prepared. But as I said, it's just a report from Rogov. He's undoubtedly very well informed, and I've no doubt that this report is true, but without having more details, it's difficult to assess exactly the value of what he's telling us. Well, a little to the east, we have now been receiving virtually no news for some time now from Vuhledar. The last reports confirmed by the Ukrainians is that Vuhledar is completely surrounded, that the Russians have now cut all the main roads, that their troops are located on the northern outskirts of Vuhledar, that the Russians have been dropping leaflets on the Ukrainian troops, mostly at the 72nd Brigade, in Vuhledar, calling on them to surrender. So we've had those reports, but no reports about whether there's been continued fighting in Vuhledar or what exactly is going on. Now, I think, by the way, that ideas that the 72nd Brigade can break out and escape north are now should be discounted. I think that possibility does not exist. The Ukrainian High Command failed to extract the 72nd Brigade and withdraw from Vuhledar when that was still possible, and the 72nd Brigade and the Ukrainian troops in Vuhledar are still trapped. Now, the military summary channel is suggesting that the reason we're not getting reports from Vuhledar is because there is some kind of surrender negotiation underway between the Russian military and the men of the 72nd Brigade, or whatever command there is still exists of the troops of the 72nd Brigade in Vuhledar. Now, that is not impossible, and of course, I don't know, but my own view is that almost certainly continued fighting in Vuhledar is still taking place. However, I suspect that by now the Russians control all the circuit around the town. It's not particularly big, and probably most of the main positions. And though the fighting is probably still intense, and probably there's still artillery strikes and missile and rocket strikes by the Russian forces and continued bombing attacks and all that kind of thing, I suspect that what we're really talking about now are mopping up operations rather than a real operation to capture Vuhledar. And that might continue for some time. The 72nd Brigade is one of the best, most motivated, most resolute brigades of the Ukrainian army. The men of the 72nd Brigade have been going through hell over the last couple of days. As I said, I've been seeing the bombing and the artillery strikes on Vuhledar, and they are beyond anything I can imagine. For the record, they're even worse than what we're seeing in South Beirut at the moment, and that is saying something. But no doubt some of them are there, still in the basements and the fortified positions and perhaps the bunkers and the tunnels that the Ukrainians have created beneath Vuhledar. And as I said, they're highly motivated soldiers, very proud soldiers, no doubt. And I would not be surprised if some of them decide that they're going to fight on to the bitter end, that military honor and patriotism allows for no other option. I am afraid, by the way, that this is the case. In my opinion, the only proper and acceptable thing to do for the Ukrainian High Command, for Zelensky and Syrsky, is to order these men to surrender and lay down their arms. But I don't seriously believe that Zelensky and Syrsky will ever give an order of that kind. So this brigade, this courageous brigade, is going to be completely destroyed. This is what I think is happening at the present time in Vuhledar. Just saying. So anyway, there is lots of fighting going on north of Vuhledar. Even as the Russians have surrounded Vuhledar itself, they continued their offensive towards Novoukrainka, Katerinovka, Yelizavetka, all of these other villages north of Vuhledar. No doubt they will eventually capture these places. Once Vuhledar itself falls, which it will, lots of additional Russian troops will be released, and the operation to clear all of these villages will then take place, and then the Russians will be able to advance on Kurachovo from a different direction, and, well, an encirclement operation of the Ukrainian troops in Kurachovo can then begin. So that, I think, is probably only a question of time before it happens. For the record, I don't expect the fighting, such as it is in Vuhledar itself, to continue for very long. Anyway, further north, we're getting lots more news. Firstly, it seems the Ukrainians now confirm that the Russians have entered Tsukurinye, this village to the south of Selidovo. The Russians captured the coal mine north of Tsukurinye, and of course they captured the town of Ukrainsk. Tsukurinye, important position, important village. If the Russians capture it, it will assist in the encirclement of Kurachovo to the south, and it would assist in the encirclement of Selidovo to the north. And there are confirmation that the Russians have entered Tsukurinye from the Ukrainians themselves. There's been comments about this, that the Russians are now in the village. The Ukrainians are still resisting. But again, looking at the overall picture, looking at where the Russians are, the fact that they're in Ukrainsk, they're in Zelenie Pershe and Zelenie Druga. They have occupied apparently a significant part of Girnik, or Gornyak, as the Russians call it, the town to the south of Ukrainsk. They have apparently advanced west of Tsukurinye from the coal mine, north of Tsukurinye. They've reached the railways that are located to the west of Tsukurinye, to the northwest of Tsukurinye. How are the Ukrainians going to be able to resist for long in this village? How are they going to be able to send reinforcements there? The Russians very soon will control all of the access points. They will be able to surround any Ukrainian troops in the village. The Ukrainians can probably withdraw still, especially during night time. But I can't imagine that they'll be able to defend themselves in this particular village for very long. And the military summary channel again makes the completely correct point that if Tsukurinye falls, not only will this cause a crisis for the Ukrainians southwards in Kurachovo, but with the Russians advancing west, already west of Tsukurinye, occupying the railways, occupying more territory, advancing north towards Selidovo itself from the south. Of course, they already control parts of the eastern, some of the places in Selidovo in the east. Well, any Ukrainian troops who are still in Selidovo risk very soon becoming surrounded, given that even as the Russians advance south of Selidovo towards the west, the Russians are advancing west of Selidovo, westwards in the north. They've captured Novogrodivka. They've apparently captured Krasny Yar and Kruty Yar, and reports say they've captured the village of Nikolaevka, located close to Mirnograd. They've been pushing westwards from Novogrodivka to capture the village of Sukhya Yar and apparently Lysivka. Before long, all of the roads and all of the railways leading into Selidovo will be threatened by the Russians, either with capture, the Russians will be able to cut these roads, or in the alternative, the Russians will have fire control, mortars and artillery and FPV drones able to fly over these roads, interrupting supplies to the Ukrainian troops in Selidovo. It looks to me as if the best thing the Ukrainians could do, again, is to withdraw from Selidovo as soon as possible. And if we go further north towards Mirnograd, I mentioned yesterday that there are reports that the Russians have now captured the village of Nikolaevka, which is located apparently about 1 kilometer south of Mirnograd. There are some claims that the Russians don't control all of this village, that the Ukrainians still control some buildings in the village. I don't know. That may be true, it may not be true, but I think at this stage it really hardly matters. It's only a question of time before the entire village falls. Anyway, what the Russians have apparently been doing is they've been capturing the various fortified positions that the Ukrainians hurriedly created south of Mirnograd over the last couple of weeks. The trench lines, which Marina Bezuglaya, the Ukrainian MP, was saying she found deserted. The Ukrainian soldiers told Ukrainska Pravda that these trenches are basically undefendable because they lie in the middle of the fields. They're not close to any tree line, so they have no vegetable cover, forest cover. Anyway, the Russians are rapidly clearing all of these fortifications. There are then no fortified positions whatsoever south of Mirnograd, which is, as I said, only a kilometer or two away. And the way is open for the Russians to advance into Mirnograd and to start occupying buildings inside Mirnograd. Mirnograd, suburb of Pakrovsk. Before the conflict, it had a population apparently of around 40,000 people. It's a lot less than that now, just saying. But anyway, it's likely that some point, maybe in a week's time, the battle for Mirnograd, and by extension, the battle for Pakrovsk, will start. And as I've said previously, I think that once it starts in earnest, which it will only do after Selidovo falls, by the way, of that I am convinced, but I think Selidovo will fall fairly soon. Once the battle for Pakrovsk begins in earnest, I do not think that the Ukrainians are going to be able to hold their positions in Pakrovsk for very long. Anybody who is expecting a prolonged battle for Pakrovsk, like the battles for Bakhmut and Avdiivka and Toretsk, not that the battle for Toretsk has lasted very long, but anyway, anybody who's expecting that kind of battle, I think is going to find that the Ukrainians are not in a position to wage it, and that Pakrovsk, once the battle for Pakrovsk begins, that Pakrovsk will fall under Russian control very soon. Anyway, further east, lots of information coming from Toretsk. Very difficult for me to understand what this information is. I said in a recent program that I thought claims that the Russians are in control of Toretsk already were premature, and so it has proved. But it seems as if the Russians are now close to cutting Toretsk in half, that they've broken through deep into Toretsk itself. They control large areas of the high-rise building areas within Toretsk, and that they've now resumed on advancing through Toretsk in the eastern suburbs, the eastern parts of Toretsk as well. And lots of fighting going on there. But there are reports that the situation in Toretsk is now becoming very critical, and that it's now going to be the case fairly quickly that resistance in Toretsk, Ukrainian resistance in Toretsk, will be collapsing. Now, there's been some news, in fact, a long article from Raidovka about the fighting in Chasiv Yar. They say that the Russians, having captured Kalinivka and Kryogorevka, two villages to the north of Chasiv Yar, and by the way, east of the Seversky Donets aqueduct, having captured both of those villages, having occupied a significant amount of territory close to these villages, but west of the aqueduct, north of Chasiv Yar, and having crossed the aqueduct to the south of Chasiv Yar, that the Russians are now very close to conducting an envelopment operation, cutting all the supply roads into Chasiv Yar. Of course, they've been battling through the central areas of Chasiv Yar, and that the Russians, again, the suggestion is, the claim is that it's now fairly soon that the supply situation for the Ukrainian troops still defending in Chasiv Yar is going to become impossible, and that the Ukrainians in Chasiv Yar are either going to have to withdraw, or, like their brethren in Vuhledar, they will risk encirclement themselves. Anyway, there we go. That's the situation there. In Kursk region, there are now reports this morning that the Russians have entered the village of Svedlikovo to the northwest of Sudzha, and that they've started a storming operation of Plechovo, the village to the southwest of Sudzha. If the Russians capture these two villages, they will have fire control over the main road leading into Sudzha from Ukraine. And the entire Ukrainian grouping in Kursk could find itself surrounded. So that's the situation on the battlefronts. Now, yesterday, there were reports that the Russians conducted another massive missile strike with hypersonic missiles on the Ukrainian airbase at Starokonstantinov. There are reports that more F16s have been destroyed. There is no confirmation, of course, about this from any party. I've seen claims that up to 5 F16s, or one report even suggested 9 F16s, have been destroyed in shelters in Starokonstantinov. I don't know whether that is the case or not, but note that the Russians are attacking a particular airbase with expensive Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. 3 of these missiles launched in one strike. 4 of these missiles launched in a second strike. 7 in total. That suggests that the Russians have intelligence that something very valuable is located at this particular airbase. Logically, that is most likely going to be the F-16s, and it's plausible that the Russians have destroyed some or many of them. Anyway, that's all I know about that operation. Now, to repeat again, we are on the brink of a major war in the Middle East. I am confident that it will come, even if the Iranians continue to exercise superhuman restraint in the face of all of this, and the fact that apparently the Supreme Leader himself, Ayatollah Khamenei, has been taken to a place of safety. That suggests to me that the Iranians now expect all-out war between themselves and Israel over the next couple of hours or days. Just saying. Even as that war plays out, it is the Ukrainian conflict which in the long term is going to be the more consequential one. What will happen is that if we do get an all-out conflict in the Middle East, the focus of world attention is going to shift from the conflict in Ukraine, especially if this conflict in the Middle East starts to have an effect on the political situation in the United States and perhaps in Europe, and starts also to have an effect on movements of world oil prices. Just saying. But in the meantime, as that plays out, the Russians will have more freedom to wrap up in Ukraine. And going back to that article by Aurélien, to emerge from the war as by far the strongest military, and by the way, let's say economic power in Europe and in Western Eurasia. What that means for the long term, we'll just have to see. But it will have an effect in Europe and, as I said, for the future of the Middle East. Well, that's the end of my program today. There'll be more from me soon. I hope tomorrow, but I'm not in a position to guarantee it. In the meantime, let me remind you again that you can tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. And also, please also remember you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. And don't forget to support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and to check out our shop. Links under this video. So that's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.